Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Places of Pika. We're really excited to start our Saturday morning with you. We have almost 200 people registered for today's event, so we're really excited. Thanks again for joining us this morning. Stephen, can you click the next slide? My name is Tanya Mickelson, and I'm the events manager at Columbia Land Trust. Before I introduce our program today, I'd like to acknowledge the resiliency of Indigenous peoples and that no matter where you're tuning in from this morning, you are on Native land. I'd also like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during today's webinar, you'll be able to put your questions for today's presenters in either the chat feature or the Q&A box. And at the end of today's presentation, we'll have a period of Q&A time to get to those questions, and so feel free to utilize the chat feature or Q&A box at any time during today's presentation. As time allows, we'll get to as many questions at the end, as I mentioned, but we will also be recording all of the questions and look forward to answering any remaining ones in the coming weeks. Getting us started today is Columbia Land Trust Forest Conservation Director Cherie Kearney. Cherie was one of the Land Trust's first employees and has spent her career protecting and conserving our region's forest habitat. Welcome, Cherie.
Hi, everybody. I am delighted to be here, and I want to say a little bit about, can you forward that for me? Mm-hmm. A little bit about Columbia Land Trust before we have our presentation. The mission at Columbia Land Trust, our mission is to conserve and care for land and water and wildlife of this whole Columbia River region on the lower region through sound science and strong relationships. We work in about, this is a map of, just to give you an idea of the big picture. This is Oregon and Washington and the Columbia River, about 250 miles up, so about where the John Day River runs in on the Oregon side, and 50 miles in each direction. This is 5 ecoregions, very, very distinct part of the world, where on the coast, we can get as much as 120 inches of rain a year. And as you go east and you arrive at the east end of this region, you might be down to 7 or 9 inches a year. So just a very varied region. For conservation planning at Columbia Land Trust, we're very thoughtful about having priority watersheds, priority areas that we want to conserve land. And to date, next slide, we've conserved over the last 30 years, what this map is showing you in bright yellow, we've conserved 50,000 acres. And you can see that bright yellow relative to priority areas. In our conservation agenda that we just updated, we anticipate and we have a vision of conserving 100,000 acres in the next 10 years, 100,000 more. So we have really accelerated our pace. Why? Because we live in such a rich area, eco-regionally and nature-rich area with natural resources. We can make a difference in climate change and habitat and all the suite of benefits that preserving nature brings in our region. Next slide. And just to bring us kind of down in and close to home, this is a piece of pika habitat, and it's in the Columbia Gorge. When we conserve land at Columbia Land Trust, we look, it's up close and personal for a particular species like a pika, but we have to think broadly also. We have to think about what's a resilient future for one species, which will benefit many more things. So we look at our conservation in terms of the broadness that will allow a pika to exist and be resilient into a changing climate, as well as the suite of benefits that multiple species get, including ourselves, from conserving connected habitats. So today we're going to learn about American Pika, and I want to introduce Stephen Clark, who's our presenter. Stephen's a professor of biology at Clark College, and he has been a teacher his whole career from kindergarten to college. He's got degrees in psychology, religion, environmental science, and deaf education. He's supported research. He's got a real passion for nature, though, as well as teaching. He's supported research for the endangered western pond turtle in the Columbia Gorge. But over the past 10 years, he's participated in research led by a preeminent scientist, Dr. Eric Beaver with the USGS, who is the leading scientist for American Pika. Stephen serves on the board of the Washington Native Plant Society. He loves his work for the University of Washington Rare Plant Care. He has worked the last few years with Oregon Fish and Wildlife on surveying sage grouse leks. And left with free time, you're going to find him on a wooded trail, running with his dog, or with me, his wife, and our granddaughter off on some nature adventure. So I'm tickled to introduce my husband, Stephen Clark.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you, Cherie, for the introduction, and Tanya. Well, today we're going to learn about pikas. What Tanya and the Columbia Land Trust asked me to do was share a little bit about this creature that more people realize lives in the Columbia Gorge, but people don't know a bunch about it, and I know a fair amount about it, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about that. Here's the critter right here. It's an unusual population because usually these guys live up at timberline. You'd see them when you're on a trail up by a ski lodge somewhere where there's a lot of rocks. They are talus rock slide, obligate, meaning they are obligated to live there. It's not just I prefer it. You won't find them living in places where there aren't big rocks, and what they'll do is crawl down under them, and they'll have their little warrens down beneath there. So this is an unusual population because they're not at timberline. They are, in fact, the lowest elevation population of pikas in North America. And here's their scientific name. I'm going to show you a video in a minute that talks a little bit about the natural history. So I'm going to start off by letting you know the natural history. And natural history is a way of saying, just a description of this animal. Then I'll talk about the pika that are in our gorge, the Columbia River Gorge, because that is unusual. I'll talk about the Eagle Creek fire and reproduction of the pikas. It's kind of an interesting topic. And then at the very end, what we can do for pikas. Presumably, if you're on a conference like this, you're kind of interested in them. Now, my first thing I want to share with you is a video, and it's been a little bulky. I showed this video as we were sort of rehearsing, and sometimes I got booted off of Zoom. So if that happens, just go right back to your link and get back on. But let me share that for you. All I want you to do is get a little sense of this little critter that is, I'm kind of thinking right here, I want to say active right now, this time of day, today. I think that is true, but it's a little, I've been looking for them recently, and they're a little hard to find right now. It's still a little bit early in the season, so they minimize their time where they're outside. But here's what the guy would look like. By the way, you notice when he bends down, there's that dark fur at his shoulder. This is an animal that has undercoat. So they really have a well-developed two-layer fur system. Some of you will have dogs that have that. They've got that beautiful colored coat on top, but way down underneath, there's that dense stuff. These guys have that dense undercoat right there that we're seeing. And there it is sitting on a rock, making a little call. And in fact, that call is mostly how I find the Oregon pika, because 90% of the time I hear them rather than see them. Hey, it looks like it worked, and I got successfully back to our video without having any trouble with with the zoom. Well, let's talk about the pika. First of all, it's a lagomorph. Lago means it's a Latin root of hare, as in rabbit, but it's not a rabbit. Hares and rabbits are a little bit different. So I'm saying lagomorph. It means hare shaped. That's what it means. And here's some characteristics, of course. When we see a hare or a rabbit, we expect kind of long back legs. We expect a nice fluffy tail, long ears. Here's something that you wouldn't expect, but that is true. If you put your tongue behind your front teeth, like I'm doing my little picture right here, if you're in the rabbit or hare family or pikas, you're going to feel 2 extra little peg teeth right behind there. So hopefully you don't feel that right now. And then when you look at this lovely picture like this, you can see, oh, okay, maybe it is a hare. I say that because a lot of people say, oh, yeah, I've seen a pike. It's a rodent, right? It's not a rodent. It's a lagomorph. There's the long tail or leg, if you will, not very long, kind of cute. But you can see this guy's got a little lagomorph leg. Doesn't have that little puffy tail that we'd expect. And although it does have big ears, they're not the long ears that you would think of. But anyway, that's our little critter. It's a lagomorph. This is its specialized habitat up at timberline where there's a rock slide. They will be able to crawl down in the little holes and the interstitial places underneath the rock, and they'll have a little nest and they'll make their living. I do teach biology and I love biology, and my experience is this is a real interesting experience, but my experience is that other people like biology too. Of course, I got a bunch of students, they sign up for it, so maybe I've got a biased idea. So I'm going to sprinkle in some biology in here. And here's the first little piece. They are a specialized creature. So there's kind of a continuum of critters that goes from specialized to generalist. Here's a specialized bird. This is the American dipper. It hunts by ducking underneath the water and kind of bird swimming underneath and catching whatever it can and eating things, but that's very specialized. It only lives where there's fast running water. You won't find it at your feeders in the backyard. Here's a generalist, the coyote. It can live in a forest, in Chicago. It can live in all kinds of places, eat all kinds of different things. Here's a specialist. It's a skunk cabbage. It will be found with flooded, moist soils. Here's a generalist. This is the alder. It goes everywhere. So you'll see these biota, any living thing, that can range from generalist to specialist. Both of them have their advantages and disadvantages. And the pika is a specialist. And the specialist pika needs to have rocks and cool temperature. And I mentioned before that this population of pika is an unusual one because it's the lowest elevation in North America. And Eric Bieber one time explained it as sort of, in the Columbia Gorge, we have this Goldilocks of habitat. It's not to this or to that, it's just right. And what we've been trying to do in our research is figure out what are the key traits that make the gorge just right. So this high elevation animal can come way down here and have a successful population way out of its range. It'd be like having a cactus grow just south of the Olympic Peninsula. So why? What is it that makes this the Goldilocks habitat for the pikas? First of all along the Oregon side, you can take that beautiful drive where you see waterfall after waterfall after waterfall, and that drive is shady. So shade means we've got cooler temperatures. And then you've got cliffs, and cliffs mean wherever there's rocks down at the bottom, you're going to have rock slides. So right away, we have two things that are helping the pikas. We have rocks, they're an obligate rock slide creature, and we have shade. So what we would think is as being a habitat that's far too warm, well, it's not quite that warm because of the habitat being in such shade. That's on the Oregon side. The Washington side has rocks because it's still the gorge, still that narrow part of the Columbia River where rocks tumble down and make habitat. But the Washington side is less shady, a little bit warmer, and predictably, fewer pikas. So, beautiful picture. I think of this guy as a winter wonder. This guy, the pikas, they can survive in very low temperatures. Now, there's one thing as a biology person I'm familiar with, but let me share it, and I think it'll resonate with you. The smaller your body is, even smaller humans like a child, the smaller the body is, the quicker they become cold. They'll lose temperature. It has to do with their surface area being high relative to their weight. So that's why if you're walking outside, it's your little child that's going to get cold before you will typically. It's a bit unusual to find an alpine critter that's really small. If you are really small and you've got some things that you have to manage because you're going to be in danger of getting very cold. One thing that you can't quite see, but you can easily imagine it, these guys have fur on the bottom of their feet. So you take your dog's paw or your cat's paw, and they've got these pads all exposed. These guys have little fur. It's like they're on slippers all the time. So if you're looking for managing the cold weather, it's a challenge for a lot of animals. Well, here's a varied thrush. That guy will fly out. He'll migrate. So here's a small animal. Thrush, how do you manage it? How do you not die in this cold season? I fly to where it's warmer. It's not that big a deal. What about you, elk? You're large. These guys go uphill and downhill over the season. So they'll be at a lower elevation in the winter and they'll move upper elevation later. So they manage to avoid the most difficult weather circumstances. Here's marmots. I have to pause because they're adorable. These guys hibernate. So they share a rocky habitat similar to the pika at higher elevation. But what these guys do is they say, hey, I can't migrate. I'm not going to go up and downhill. I'm a rock obligate. What am I going to do? I'm going to hibernate and drop my temperature so low. I'll turn my thermostat down so low that I will barely be using the calories that I've stored over the summer and fall. So that's their strategy. The pika does not hibernate. You would think, oh, small animal, hibernate. Here's an animal that survives in the winter, and it's big enough that it doesn't have quite, this is a wolverine, doesn't have quite the difficulty that the pikas do. The wolverine does eat a ton in the winter, however. This guy, it neither migrates nor hibernates, and it lives in the cold. It's a marvel. It's a winter wonder. One of the things it does, and one of the reasons it's so cute, is it collects. So if it doesn't hibernate, well, how does it get food when it's all snowy like this? You know, where are you going to go to get all your food? I will store it. So what these guys do is they spend their summer and fall getting extra food, not just the food they're going to eat that day, extra food, and then they'll cache it in these hay piles like this. Well, this is a little unusual right here, because this guy's taken the hay and he's moved it, starting to move it under, maybe what they'll do is they'll dry it. If they were to eat all this stuff right now, the plants make their own defenses. The plants say, hey, I would rather just grow my flowers and make my seeds. And if you guys keep eating me all the time, it's not going to work. So I'm going to make some toxins in there. I'll put some toxins in the plant. The pika says, that's all right. I'm going to store you until these toxins sort of dissipate. And so the pikas will gather their food stuff, enough for a winter, enough for October, November, December, January, February, March, you know, and they'll store it. I've seen up on the Pacific Crest Trail near Mount Adams, I've seen hay piles as big as a small beach ball. Just a big pile they got out there. And there's little pika wars. Some pikas will say, why would I go pick this when I see a big bunch of it right here? No one's looking, I'll just take some. So this is real neat to see. You will often see them with a mouthful of material, and they have an instinctual behavior, which is, don't eat it right now. Let's take it, dry it somewhere, and we'll eat some of it later. So that's how they manage. They don't hibernate, but they've got a bunch of hay in the barn. So here's something that, notice this image, beautiful image. It was taken by Linda Steiner, who is in the audience today. So thank you very much. She's a Cascade Pika Watch volunteer. And what I love about this picture that Linda captured was this guy is just ensconced in moss. Now, when we first started doing research, I say we, I mean Eric Bieber's team, and I was on that team, we didn't look at the moss very much. But researcher Johanna Varner and Liz Deering, they said they had the hypothesis that moss, which you can think of as like iceberg lettuce, not a lot of nutrition. Moss, we dismissed it. We thought that's not, you know, when we were doing all the plant inventories, what plants are around where we find pikas? You know, what do they like to eat? We dismissed moss, and Johanna and Deering, they found that moss was a big deal, not only of their diet, but also the insulation. So if you have talus, rock slide, that's great. But if you've got moss on top of the talus, ooh, wonderful. So when I'm out walking along on a trail and I see a rock slide, just a bunch of gray rocks, I think, oh, there might be pikas there. But if I see rock slide with a bunch of moss on it, then I think, I'm going to listen. I would think in the gorge, we could really find something there. So moss, it's a big deal. This guy, yeah, he's basically living in his salad. Some of the work that Eric Bieber was initially trying to ascertain, I say initially because this has been a long project and some of the scientific goals and focuses change a little bit as you learn. For example, when it was found that moss is a big deal, we started measuring moss, you know, which is what a good scientist would do. So Eric Bieber, what we wanted to do is figure out where the edges are. We know that's an unusual place that the pika live. How do they survive in this habitat that's such low elevation? And what we wanted to do is figure out, well, how far east or how far west do they live? The thought is this: if you've got an animal that is at the very edge of their habitat, then any little damage, I'll say, to the habitat at this very edge of where they can survive, if you have any degradation of the habitat, you're going to see that edge change a little bit. So if you want to really figure out what is the most important part for a pika to survive, go to where pikas are barely hanging on, or any other animal for that matter. Go to the place where they're at the edge of what they can survive, and it would be more obvious which are the crucial parts of their habitat. So here's where pika are on the Oregon side. And unfortunately, by the way, this is for a different talk, but this arrow seems to be moving a little bit west. Some of the sites that we initially found pikas way back in 2012-13, we're not finding there anymore. It looks like it's constricting, which is what you would expect with climate change. On the Washington side, not a big surprise because we don't have the shade. So you've got talus over here by white salmon, but it's too hot. And we have a little less area. So that's kind of what we were working on. That's what the research project that I joined, we were trying to figure out. We would go on all kinds of trails, and wherever there's a talus patch, we would stop and do surveys for pikas. Let's talk about the fire. By the way, let me say that if you have questions, it would be wonderful if you would write them into the Q&A. And I'm saying that now because sometimes, you know, as I'm talking about something, you'll say, oh, that reminds me, and you might forget the question later. So if you have a question, put it in there, and Tanya will help me at the end to kind of look for themes or things that people are wondering. If we were in some lecture hall, I would happily entertain questions all the time through. It's not so easy on a Zoom call, but you write your questions down. I'd love to hear what makes you curious. And one of the reasons I say that is what makes you curious is tied to what you care about. And if you care about nature like the Columbia Land Trust does and like I do, then I feel like this is a nice service. It's a nice service to respond to people's natural interest and care and curiosity and satisfy that and make them even more interested. So please think of what you want to know. So some of you might recognize that this is the Eagle Creek Trail, and these are the switchbacks that are pretty close to the top. And in fact, historically, I haven't been up there and I don't know the status of this one in particular, but there were pikas that lived right here. Not a lot. I would go up to this little patch of rocks and I'd see if I could hear one or two. But where the trail disappears, there's another switchback and I'd hear one or two. Now for pikas, they are territorial. So the reason you only, in fact, when I say one or two, one of those will say two. Why two? I thought I scared that guy away. They're territorial. So he or she would say, no, there's one right here. The other guy was an interloper. And there's one right here. We only get together in March and April for, SEX. But that's kind of what's happening. So here's the Eagle Creek fire and, burned right through some known pika habitat. Couple things about that fire. One, fire is natural and fire has a natural frequency. So I'm going to pick numbers that I don't really know, but in the rainforest of the Olympic Peninsula, you might expect there to be a forest fire on a given patch of land once every 200 years. If you go to Wenatchee and pick a patch of land, you might expect a forest fire to occur once every 10 or 15 years, and that would be natural. And if it's natural, then the organisms in that area would adapt to it. Well, fire researchers say that the gorge fire, although it was huge to us, 50,000 acres, and it seemed devastating, and it is devastating, that's not to say that the animals hadn't evolved to persist after such a challenge. We're in a place where forest fires happen, and if it's on the regular rotation, which that one seemed to be, when the fire was going, I felt miserable. But in the logical part of my brain, I said, I think we're going to have some survival because this is not too far out of the norm. So here's a typical spot. I'm standing on a trail when I take this picture, and I'm looking uphill. And I look at these rocks, and I say, I even look right where my cursor is right there, and I say, look at that hole. It's big enough for pikas to get in. And so those things make me kind of, I'm interested. And so this is a patch that does, before the fire, it did have pikas in it. So what we did right after the fire, we wanted to survey the sites that did have pikas and see, did they survive? Here's that same spot before and after, of course. Now, a couple good things. You see that not 100% of the trees died. Certainly some of them did. Here's something that concerns us for the pikas, and that is considerable die-off of moss. So from a pika perspective, I look at that and think, yikes, the world is your salad and your salad just got destroyed. So I worried about the pikas in that spot. That's what we did. We went after we finally, and I'll let my irritation show through here a little bit. What would have been nice after the fire would be to go in October or November when there were embers, but it was not a conflagration. It would be nice to go out and see if the pikas were there. Why? Pikas will die of one of two things. They would have died because the fire gave them too much carbon monoxide and they couldn't survive it. Perhaps even just the heat killed them. But what about the fact that their food supply was gone? Maybe they survived the fire and then they starved because of the lack of food to eat. That would have been scientifically a valuable thing. We couldn't do that. We didn't get out there until after the next spring. So we know there was death, but we couldn't tell if it's directly from the fire or indirectly from the fire. Here's something that's interesting. So as we had a certain number of patches, and we walk out and we would survey them over the years, and we found that of the patches we surveyed, 80% had pikas in them. And after the fire, that 80% number dropped to 50. So that's a loss of pika, but the 50 also means they weren't knocked down so low that you worried about their survival. We worried about how long it would take for them to get back. And in 2019, that 50 had jumped up to 60 to 70. So we have kind of a small sample size. Scientifically, that's not great, but it does look like the fire was in 2017, 18, 19, 20, in 3 or 4 years, it looks like they've recovered. Here's something interesting. There's a little temperature sensor. So one of the things we do is we're puzzling, how can the pikas survive in this Columbia Gorge habitat that's not way up at timberline? How cold is it? How hot does it get? What can they survive in? So we have these temperatures sensors, and these will have a little battery in them, and they'll take the temperature every hour, and they'll do that for a year. And so then we'll get the data from them. This one was sitting on the surface and it melted. We also have temperature data sensors that we put on a little wire, and we thread them down into the rocks about 3 or 4 feet. Here's what happened. Temperature in Celsius. That means this is a refrigerator temperature. And the fire was going, and in the talus, there's our temperature. It stayed relatively cool. It went up, but not very high. It went from like 44 degrees Fahrenheit to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. It's still refrigerator temperature, and that's just 3 or 4 feet down in the talus. So what that means is, if I'm a pika sitting here on the surface and there's a forest fire right over there, it's going to be extremely hot, deadly hot. And I go under the rocks, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, they can survive it temperature-wise. Now, I don't know anything about the gas or the air, but I just thought it was remarkable. And if the Columbia Land Trust is saving habitat where you've got rocks that are deep enough, sometimes you get talus patches where you can't go very deep. That's going to be trouble. But this was remarkable. It was remarkable that we had some temperature sensors down deep enough to see that they could survive the temperature. Again, we don't know about the gas, but the temperatures were decent. Some people say, where would I see or hear a pika? And I say here because 90% of the time when I say, oh, there's pika, 90% of the time I come to that conclusion because I hear them. And you will see them. This is a nice spot. I'm walking along. I noticed the trail in the gorge is getting really rocky. We're coming to some rock slide patch. These rocks right here might be a little bit small. I mean, if you could put, the pika is about the size of a baked potato. So if you can take a baked potato and put it through those little holes in the rocks, then you're in good shape. And the place where they make their hay is going to be under a big rock, a boulder. They wouldn't make a little hay pile right here on any of these rocks that I'm looking at casually right here in this picture. But if I walk out to the middle of that trail and then I look up, I say, oh, I see a real big, a rock that's as big as a chair in your living room. Then I look around and I see if I can find some hay there. So this would be a spot where if you're walking along, you would want to listen for pika. And what you're listening for is ee, ee, and that might be it. So this is sometimes looking for pika is a little bit like fishing. You might not catch anything, but don't you like being out there? So when you go out looking for pikas, it's like, ee, okay, my friends, that's it. Did you enjoy that? Because sometimes you just hear a few little eeps. Seriously, the biologists call them eeps, E-E-P-S. So you'll hear a few eeps and that's it. Now, sometimes people will do what they call a sit survey. So they'll just go at the right time of day, which is, I'll talk about that in a minute, and they'll just sit down real quietly, like a bird watcher, and they'll wait with their binoculars, and they'll hear eep, or they'll see a little scurry. And they'll say, was that a squirrel? Or was that a pika? No tail? Pika. So this is the kind of place you're going to look. The Gorge Trail 400 has a bunch of spots like this. When are they active? Like a lot of mammals, they're active in the early morning and the evening. So when I go out and do pika surveys, I try and get on the trailhead by 6 o'clock. And I'm looking around 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. I do it in the summertime. And in the summertime, 9 o'clock, if it's a warm day, I start to say, I'm probably past the peak. And at 11 or 12, I feel like I could easily go to a patch like this and the pikas are already 3 feet under. I could say, oh, there's no one here, and I would get a false negative. So when I go looking for pikas, I look in the morning. 6 o'clock, 7, 8, 9, 10. And if it's a cool day, 11 and 12, I'd stop at noon. You can do a similar thing in the evening. I get a little more benefit in the morning, but that's when I would go. Reproduction. So a couple things about this picture. It's hard to distinguish a baby from an adult. One reason is because the babies will stay under the rocks. You're not going to see them until they're close to being weaned. And so when they do come out, they're already grown up a little bit bigger. And then it's like, is that a little one or a big one? But maybe you'll agree with me that this guy looks a little small. He looks like his whole body is the size of 3 of his head or her head. Sometimes you can hear a bunch of ee, 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 and then ee. And you can, especially Johanna Varner and those who really specialize in the pika, they can hear the difference. And they'll say something like, from a biology point of view, I would guess 80% chance I just heard a juvenile. So there's a juvenile. And there's the mother. Mother will carry the mating time. I'll talk about that in a minute, but the mother will carry the baby for 30 days. That's the gestation period. Then they're born, and then the mother has to be very busy nursing. And so the mother will nurse every couple hours, and that means you're going to find the female doing a lot of foraging. This is Valentine's Day. That's kind of the very earliest that these guys would start mating behaviors. Mating behaviors are interesting. It looks like fighting. Remind you of anything? So mating behaviors, these guys don't really care for one another. They're territorial, so their DNA says, I don't want company. Yet in February and March, they'll go ahead and mate. The peak time for births of pikas, we're just getting into it. In the gorge, probably late March and April. That's when they'll be born. So April births, that's a decent time of year for the Columbia Gorge population. And here's another bit of biology. Hares are born what we call precocial, like a deer is. A deer is born, and then an hour later, the fawn is supposed to get up and walk away. Pikas are born altricial, meaning their eyes are closed for another 10 days. They're preemie, they're not ready to do much. So that's just what's happening way down under the rocks. These aren't pikas. I couldn't find a picture. I don't know if there's anyone who's seen that. But I kind of know that because a female pika wouldn't have 4 babies. She'll have 2. In fact, maybe the first time that she gets pregnant, she will have only 1. So let's say the babies are born in April. In May, they're out on the rocks. They're little, and as soon as the mother stops nursing, the mother's oxytocin levels will drop a little bit, and at that point, the adults become less tolerant of the offspring. And so as they are intolerant, then they'll have territorial disputes. So they'll try and harass each other out of their area. That sounds mean on the one hand, but from a biology point of view, if everyone's in one area, they all run out of food. But if you force everyone to be in a certain spot, and for us, it's about 25 meters, 75 feet, that'll be the home range of one adult. So when the babies are born and they get on the rocks, they're going to start being, hey, get out of here from the mother. And when that happens, they're going to disperse. If they're fortunate, they might be able to take a spot on the very same talus patch where their mom was, but that would be if one of the older members of that talus patch died. Then a spot opens up and the baby gets scared away from where she had been born, and she goes to a place where no one's hassling her. Well, she doesn't know it, but another pika might have died in the winter. And so that can be her territory now. But if that's not the case, they're going to have to travel. They'll be scared out of their patch and they'll have to go to another one. This is a time for all babies where the mortality rate is high. You've got a naive animal, meaning they don't really know much about predators. By the way, the eep is a signal for the pikas. I see something that alarms me, and sometimes you'll see this eep, and then they'll all duck under the talus. I saw Joe Bettis was in the group here, and Joe Bettis and I were out looking at pikas years ago, and we happened to see a weasel. It's interesting, a weasel is thinner than the pikas. They would have no problem going right in the rocks after the pikas. And when pikas see a coyote, they'll holler. When pikas see a weasel, they don't want to draw attention to those. They basically say, good luck, everybody, I'm going down. And we saw a weasel at a talus patch, which was remarkable. What can I do? People like to know about things they can do for pikas. I'm sorry to say that although this is usually a wonderful opportunity, they're on a hiatus right now due to COVID, but the Oregon Zoo sponsors the Cascade Pika Watch, and you get volunteers that go out, and you have some team leaders. So you end up with a bunch of eyes and a couple experts, and you go out on the trail a couple times a year in the early morning and see if you can find pikas. And then you're contributing to some data, which is kind of valuable. Here's another thing. This won't help you with pikas, but this is what the Land Trust and the Portland Audubon do. They sponsor backyard habitat. Why do I bring that up? Because my feeling is that if you start caring for animals, all animals, then it spreads out. So here's a couple people that are saying, oh, I'm going to treat my yard differently. I didn't realize I was actually killing that many things. Now that I know that, it increases your awareness of wildlife, who's out there, the different animals, and it just goes hand in hand with, these are the kind of people, after watching their yard and changing it for animals for a year, if I were to say to them, there's an animal out there called a pika, they're going to say, tell me more. I've just recently into helping out animals. So I think that's a wonderful thing. And you can actually sign up for that through the Land Trust and get your backyard or a patch of it certified as habitat friendly. I'm a big fan of it. We have that in our yard. Here's another thing you can do. This is what Steve Clark thought. Pikas were voted the second cutest mammal, kind of just a little online popularity contest, but they are cute. And when they're cute, people care about them. And what about the animals that aren't cute? Sometimes we talk about charismatic fauna. What about the uncharismatic? Well, here's a couple of moles. I happened to see a dead mole on a trail just yesterday. And these guys are fascinating creatures on their own. But people, we've got an industry devoted to their eradication. But let me propose to you that if you look carefully, even the unloved animals have something kind of cool about them. Look at that hand. Their hands go like this. They face outward so they can almost swim through the soil. They're such good diggers. You can even get a little sense of their nails. Where are their eyes? Exactly. Evolutionarily, their eyes have gotten tinier and tinier. Why would I need them? I'm just getting them poked with little pieces of root. So they've got very minimal eyes, and they've got a naked, sensitive, flexible snout. I could go on. I read a book once about moles, but they are, one more thing. Their fur doesn't have a nap. You know how you pet your cat one way, if you pet it the other way, it doesn't feel right. These guys, it'll go either way. That way they can go forward or backward in their tunnel. There, just a few teasers on how neat it is to be a mole. But why do I say that? Because if all we care about are the mammals that are cute or the mammals, then we've got maybe a couple steps to go. Now, before you get there, I will tell you this, if anybody recoils and says, I don't know about spiders, I get that. Humans seem to have a genetic proclivity, not a necessity, but a proclivity to be alarmed by spiders. This is a native and it's called the audacious jumping spider. It's got a rather easy to see and cute couple of green pedipalps that are responsible for managing the food, but also for having a female say, hey, pretty cute right here. Also, how can you not like something that has 8 eyes? These guys, all spiders have webs, but these guys mainly sit in one spot and they survey. And that's why some people say, hey, I've got a jumping spider and it seems to be watching me. You move and they go like this. And you move, you move. So just a couple more things. That's what I think about with animals. And if you've got children, when you see something like that, the first thing you should say is, you shouldn't say, does it bite? You should say, that's fascinating. Yes, of course they bite, but they won't bite you. And then you say to your child or whoever else is with you, careful, we don't want to scare her. You try and get them into your view of, you just stumbled on something that's wonderful. I wonder what she's doing now. Do you think she's hunting? Do you think she's walking? Has she been scared? Is she just getting warm? Those are the kind of things. What else can I do? I tell this to my students. It's a sensitive topic, but the best thing we can do is rethink how many children we want to have. This is an especially fun topic to bring up when I'm talking to a group of older people who have grandchildren, but almost all the things that I worry about for ecology would be relieved if we didn't have as many humans on the planet. So I like to rethink. I like to encourage people to rethink how many children they have. Get it down to 1. I think that would be helpful. That's not part of the Land Trust mission, but that's what I say when I have talks like this. And I think if you do that, and if you care, any pika you see would be happy to say, thank you. Beep. And that's what I'm saying to you. That's the end of my talk. We'll go to questions and answers in a minute. And thank you very much for listening.
It's great. Thank you so much, Stephen. If you just want to click to the next slide, we'll just remind folks how they can go ahead and enter in their questions. We already have lots of good ones to get us started, but one thing that I did want to ask right off the bat is, Stephen, can you define what a talus is? I know you referenced that a few times throughout your talk today.
It's a rock slide. When I was first doing surveys, we actually would measure the rocks, and we wanted the rocks to be roughly the size of your head, because if they're the size of your head, that means they're big enough. So not just any rock slide big enough that you can imagine you could snake, like if you dropped your keys, could you get your hand down there and get them? Then you're in good shape. So that's what talus is. It's a rock slide.
Thank you. So a lot of people asked about kind of recreational activities around these taluses. So do activities such as hiking near or adjacent to these taluses negatively affect pikas in any way?
Of course they do, right? Of course they do. What wild animal can you go up to and it will walk towards you? None. They go the other way. Even black bears, they'll go the other way. So you can't imagine, it would be unrealistic to say that I don't scare something. We do. So the short answer is, of course. So then the more practical answer would be, how do you minimize it? How do you make it so that your impact on the animals is benign or minor? Well, for pikas, if you're hiking after 11 or 12 o'clock, they're going to be underground. They probably won't be bothered very much. If you're going to go off, if you're walking on the trail, they are mammals and they do depend on their brain enough to learn that. So I would guess, but I don't know this, I would guess that the pikas say, oh, humans always walk on that trail. It actually is no big deal. But if you were to scramble down the talus, or if your dog took off after one, that would be a problem. But hiking seems to have a minor impact on them.
Thank you. So are there other places in the world where pika live at low elevations, and how are they related to our Columbia Gorge population?
So I don't know of other low elevations. I'm sure it happens. I mean, thinking like the Pikas are what we call a whole Arctic distribution. So if this is the Earth, and this is the North Pole, and this is the South Pole, you can imagine the ice and the snow on the top kind of seeps down, almost like putting paint down. And it looks like the pikas evolved somewhere probably near Siberia and Mongolia, and they spread around the north, and then they kind of seeped down. So we find them in China, we find them in Russia, we find them in Canada, we find them, and that's how they got down here. So there are a lot of pikas in the world. It wouldn't surprise me if there's some other unusual spot where you have a low elevation population. I don't know of it, but I wouldn't be surprised.
But in this country,
No, this is the lowest elevation population in North America.
Great, thank you. So do pikas only eep for predator threats, or do they also communicate with each other using that same kind of eep sound that we heard?
Yeah, they'll eep. The males will do a mating call, which goes eep, 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 eep. So you don't hear that very often, but when you do, it'll be springtime and it'll be a male. So yeah, they do that, but they'll do it for warning, for territory. Warning meaning that there's a predator, and warning, get out of my territory. And the reason I hear them is because I walk down there, and sometimes when I'm trying to find a pika, I'll go eep myself to see if I can get a response, because they do live in a group together. So even though they're territorial, they have a social aspect to them.
Great.
I'm looking at a question here, and people are, can you think of any younger kid-friendly gorge hikes that are recommended? I like the Gorge Trail 400 because it's fairly flat, so that makes it kind of kid-friendly. What hike isn't kid-friendly? The hike becomes not kid-friendly if you go too fast, but any hike is going to be kid-friendly if you stop and look at things. If you see if can anyone find a feather? Can you find a fern which never has a flower? And what hike wouldn't be kid-friendly? Yes. The question is your hiking group kid-friendly? And if your hiking group is kid-friendly, you can do it on a street. So you can make hikes kid-friendly. But the gorge, so what you really want is one where you are going to be happy and you are able to extend a little joy to your child. So I would say pick one that you like and go slow. Don't worry about pace. Don't have a goal. Have an outie. And
love that. Thank you.
Notice things. Sometimes it's fun to take kids and have a little checklist. You try and find a leaf that's bigger than your hand. Can anyone? Well, don't pick it, but could show me who can find the smallest flower. Those make it friendly.
So speaking of hikes, are there other hiking trails specifically that you'd recommend for possibly a chance to hear pika or see them other than the Eagle Creek Trail?
I don't even do it on the Eagle Creek Trail. It's not a great trail for pikas. The Gorge Trail. So what are you looking for? You're looking for a trail that has a rock slide on it, and the lower part of the Angel's Rest is good. The middle part isn't as good because you're kind of going up the face of the cliff. The top is good. Anytime you are on a hike and you see big rocks with moss, you should look for them. I think there are. Now, I don't know very many hikes I would go on in the gorge where I wouldn't expect to see a pika or hear. I wouldn't see them, hear them.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions going back to the talus that you talk about that make up a lot of pika habitat. How are those formed?
That's a nice question. They're formed because of a freeze-thaw erosion. And I'm saying that because some of you, my students, they get real interested in things. They'll dig deep. So if you look for freeze-thaw, so imagine you've got a cliff right here. Here's the cliff wall. And you've got some pillars of rock that are on the outside, and there's a little crack between them. And if a little bit of water gets in that crack, which it will every winter, and then it freezes just a little bit, it'll force this out. And at some point, it will tumble. And so at the bottom of every cliff, you're going to have rock slides. And a lot of that in our area is freeze thaw.
Great. So
Tanya, can I jump in for a couple
yeah,
of
please,
questions?
please do.
I'm just looking at them, and you know, citizen science is actually they're calling it community science a lot of times. If I were evaluating community science, I guess the first thing I would do, it's becoming popular and it's spreading out. You can Google citizen science and then plants, or citizen science Oregon, and you can do all kinds of things and find things. What I would look for is something that you like, something that is kind of, I would look for something that try and sniff out the real science behind it. Is the data being collected by scientists so that it becomes part of the body of science that we all, humanity, can benefit from? I would look for that. But there are a lot of things out there. I mean, I volunteer for rare plants, and that's a citizen science thing. There's a thing where anytime you see a milkweed plant, which the monarch butterflies like, they want you to take a picture, give us the GPS, and send it into a database. So there's a lot of little ways to contribute. I'm hoping that next year my students at Clark College will be able to start doing some data on native bumblebees. So there's a lot of citizen science out there. I did see an interesting question about the moss and how after the moss is damaged, how long will it take? Slower than other plants, because moss don't have roots. So they have to, they'll creep along and they'll gain a few inches a year. And moss doesn't die back, it just dries out and sits there in the August. And then when the good rains come, poof, it gets back and it's ready to go. So when you damage moss, it's surprisingly negative because it takes a long time. When we go walking with Cascade Pika Watch, when they're walking on the talus, they say, try and step on the bare rock, not the moss. And if you do knock off a divot, replace it. So that's not a small thing.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we are just a couple minutes shy, coming up on an hour here. So I want to be mindful of time, but we do have a really great question here. What effects have you seen climate change play in pika populations, and are the populations shrinking faster in the gorge?
They are not shrinking faster in the gorge. And what you see with climate change, and I'm happy to say this is old news. I'm sad to say that it is news, but that the evidence for having biota, not just animals, plants or animals, wink out or become an unstable population, it's all over the place. It's one of the saddest parts of my job, is that I'm teaching biology in a time of a great extinction, you know, a mass extinction worldwide. So that's a sad thing. And one of the reasons people were studying pikas in the early 2000s was because if you have an animal that's adapted for cold, what happens when things become warm? What do? Do they go higher up the mountain? What do they do? So in some places, you can see populations winking out. However, when the American Pika was recommended to be put on the Endangered Species Act protections, it was denied. And I wouldn't say, oh, that's a sham. No, the way the law is written, that denial is reasonable. And that's because there are pikas living in other places. There, you know, it's hard to say that because you feel like, oh, don't you care? No, of course I care, but it's not endangered. And for example, for whatever reason, there is resilience in the Columbia Gorge, and that pika population seems to be doing okay. Although I did tell you that we are seeing the first shrinking of the habitat, what it looks like on the east side in Oregon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think if I've recorded all the remaining questions we haven't been able to get to, and so I look forward to connecting with you to provide answers on those, Stephen, which we can share with everyone. Yeah, go ahead.
Tanya, there are a couple that are real easy. I'm just going to
Oh, please jump in.
hit those. Are there pikas around Mount Hood? Yes, there are, but we didn't study them because we were only interested in this unusual population. So we only looked for pikas that were less than 1,000 meters high. But as you go up in elevation, you can see that they're in more of their natural habitat. And Mark Blitzer, I appreciate your question. Yeah, the sun does get pretty high, but no, our temperatures are a little bit cooler, a little bit higher. It's not just cool, it's actually the moisture, the humidity. The humidity on the Oregon side is more favorable to the pikas, mile for mile, as compared to Washington. So just a couple of things I happen to notice there, Tanya. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. So if you just want to click to the next slide, Stephen, I'll go ahead and just close out our event today. I just want to thank everybody, especially Cherie and Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us as today's presenters.
My pleasure.
Stephen, it's always such a treat to hear your passion for wildlife and for all of the research that you've done specifically with pika. So thank you so much. If you were inspired at all by any of the what you heard today or the conservation work that Columbia Land Trust does to protect wildlife habitat like pika habitat in the Columbia River Gorge, please do consider making a gift. You can do so today at columbialandtrust.org/donate. I also want to mention our next upcoming virtual event is on Tuesday, March 30th, and it is our Evergreen Circle Appreciation event. Evergreen Circle acknowledges our monthly donors and those that are having a really significant impact in monthly donations to support our work. So whether you're already a current member of Evergreen Circle or if you're just interested in learning more about how that donor group supports our work, you can join us for that event on Tuesday, March 30th, and we'll be taking a really close look at the 5 ecologically distinct ecoregions that make up our service region from our Conservation Director, Dan Royks. So you can take a look at our website, columbialandtrust.org/news.